Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us here at the Herbert T. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Ann Albert, the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Katz Center, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's program, which, by the way, is our last program of the fall semester, but don't despair. Our lineup for the spring semester is in place with all of the events now listed on our website, and we have a great set of talks and other kinds of events for you to check out in the spring. So we'll start in January with a continuation of our Canon in Context series on major works of Jewish law. That runs in January, and then there are also two new talks that were just added to that series for the month of March, dealing with the halachic canon as it was mediated by print culture and material text. So if you were joining us for those earlier talks, we invite you to rejoin. We also are honored to be hosting Menachem ben Sasson, the Chancellor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, to speak about the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So don't miss that. That was just announced. Finally, I want to point out, I want to plug, we have two programs that we call mini courses. These are in February and in April. They're multi-week interactive experiences that let you learn in depth about one topic from a professor in a sort of truncated version of the experience of a college seminar. And just a heads up, in order to keep the setting intimate for those, enrollment is limited. And so you should try to sign up as soon as you can. If you're interested, registration opens on December 20th. Before we start today's program, I want to extend particular thanks to all the people who make this and other programs possible here at the Katz Center. First of all, I thank you in the audience for joining us and for submitting such wonderful and thoughtful questions over the course of the semester. And I'm sure that you'll join me in expressing appreciation for my colleagues here at the center. So our director, Steve Weitzman, Associate Director, Natalie Dorman, our communications czar, Becky Friedman, events coordinator, Diana Dennis-Walters, and IT wizard, Brian Lipscomb. All of these people are absolutely indispensable. I cannot thank them enough. In addition, of course, we are very grateful for the material support from donors at all levels. So the Klatt family and the Harry Stern Family Foundation have been very generous. The Friends of the Katz Center is a group that's formed more recently. And if you're interested, there's information in the chat about that, and numerous individual donors. And if you have enjoyed and learned from our Zoom talks this year, please do consider including the center in your end of year giving. So today, moving on to the substance for the day, we are embarking on a conversation that's a little bit different from our usual lectures, a little bit more meta. So we're here to talk about the concepts of continuity and community, two words that are ubiquitous in contemporary American Jewish discourse, and to a lesser extent, perhaps in different ways, in and around the field of Jewish studies. Many of us take these two concepts for granted without stopping to think much about their nuances and their implications, but within some circles, they're very much a focus of interest and of concern. And so our aim here is to sort of to bring out some of those ideas. The title of the program, Who Counts and How, has in it, of course, a double meaning. It's meant to invoke the question of who is included and excluded, who counts in the sense of whose perspectives and contributions and aims are taken into account, either in Jewish spheres or in scholarly spheres devoted to the study of Jews and Jewish culture. But it also asks who counts in the sense of who is doing the counting and on what basis. How Jewish studies scholarship then is not only materially affected by prior assumptions about belonging, but also itself substantially affects notions of belonging and boundaries, sets those terms and those boundaries, and hence affects communal affairs in turn. Ultimately, this conversation was precipitated by the revelation of sexual harassment on the part of a prominent sociologist who worked particularly on Jewish continuity and worked in collaboration with and with support from communal institutions. So his notion of continuity emphasized the perpetuation of Judaism genealogically through physical reproduction, and therefore is an idea that's not neutral with respect to gender and sexuality, race, and other aspects of embodied experience. For its part, community also does as much to exclude and set boundaries as it does to include. So the events around this one figure, his role, his work, and his treatment led to a lot of thinking about both the structures and the content of Jewish studies research. There was this particularly striking connection between the concept and the culture that produced it. It can even lead to a reconsideration of what Jewish studies as a field is, has been, or ought to be. So the idea of this panel is not to rehash that scandal or the events, but to try to deepen and expand these conversations. We've invited a group of thoughtful and engaged scholars who are set to speak about it as practitioners in the field with their own personal and professional experiences, but also as thinkers whose particular research has led them to work independently of the scandal about to work on the history and makeup of the field, its aims and methods, its relationship to some group understood as the Jewish community, and diversity within both Jewish and academic spheres. So with that, I will introduce the speakers and stop talking myself and start inviting them to speak. We have four scholars with us today. First, we have Gilah Kletenik, who is a postdoctoral associate at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies at Boston University. Kletenik's research focuses on philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and Jewish thought. Currently, she's working on a book called Sovereignty Disrupted, Spinoza on the Disparity of Reality. Shaul Magid is a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College and Kogod Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. His two latest books, very recently, are Meir Kahana, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical, and Piety and Rebellion, Essays in Hasidism. Samira Mehta is Assistant Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of US family life. And her first book, Beyond Chrismica, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Finally, Ben Schreier is Mitrani Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of English and Jewish Studies at Penn State. He's author most recently of The Rise and Fall of Jewish American Literature, Ethnic Studies, and the Challenge of Identity. And since 2011, he's been the editor of the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature. Now, going forward, welcome everybody. It's nice to see your faces. We hope to have a relatively organic conversation. I do have some prepared questions, but we'll just kind of see where this goes. To our audience, please feel free to post questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, but know that because we have four speakers today, we may not have a lot of time for questions. We're not going to focus on audience questions, but rather on the internal conversation today. So I'll start by opening the door to this conversation by inviting each of you to start us off with a few words about one or both of these concepts, right? Either continuity or community. So what is potentially problematic, or at least not obvious to most people, about how these concepts work, what work they're doing, how they function, how they've been shaped or wielded by scholars and institutions? What's at stake in problematizing them in the way that has been done lately? And so we're going to go alphabetically. We'll start with Gilah. Gilah, welcome.
Hi, Anne, thank you. And thanks to the CAT Center for hosting our conversation. It's wonderful to be here with you. I see you already opened by talking about scandal, so we're just going to jump right in. And the conflict over Stephen Cohen's readmission into the scholarly community after decades of sexually harassing our colleagues turns attention to both the narrow interests of his research and to broader concerns about the field of Jewish studies. I think it solicits us to reckon with two related concerns. The first is the ethical and intellectual deficits of so-called Jewish continuity scholarship. And the second is what this research specifically says about the field of Jewish studies. Research on so-called Jewish continuity insists that Jews face a demographic crisis solvable only through increased reproduction. Our colleagues, Kate Rosenblatt, Lila Berman, and Ronit Stahl, registered the sexism and patriarchy of this kind of work. This past spring, in 2 articles, Rafe Nisanai critiqued its cis heteronormativity and its racism. What does this mean? The enterprise of Jewish continuity is structured on cis heteronormative and binary gendered ideologies. It relies on reproductive models sustained by the monogamy and marriage of the heteronuclear family. Cis woman marries cis man, they have kids, the more the merrier. This in turn bolsters and sustains sex-gender differences and ableist differences, both of which contribute to differences in divisions of labor. Able-bodied cis woman bears the children, shoulders the disproportionate burden of raising the children and maintaining the nuclear family. The outsized attention that this very particular narrow kind of Jewish demography has received does not reflect its merits, but rather its alignment with the priorities of mainstream Jewish institutions. Expectedly, the obsession with body counts and fertility rates circularly reconfirms the import of these very institutions and their continuity, and also offers them uncomplicating institutional missions and, unfortunately, undemanding expressions of Jewishness. As it happens, alternative forms of kinship, networks of care, and modes of identity are increasingly common across sectors of the Jewish community. By remaining wedded to the patriarchal heteronuclear family, these researchers, these demographers, are failing to register alternative ways of building family and being Jewish. Instead, their research continues to stigmatize and erase increasing numbers of Jews. Who exactly is marginalized by this research? The Jews excluded tend to be Jews who aren't coupled, Jews who aren't monogamous, Jews who aren't able-bodied, Jews who aren't straight, and Jews who aren't cisgender. To do its work and to do it with integrity, these particular demographers and ethnographers in question need to confront the outdated and constraining ideologies that condition their research. And this escorts us to our second point. The perceived import of Jewish continuity research exemplifies specifically the kinds of work that are most privileged in the field of Jewish studies. And I don't just mean research that aligns or coincides with Jewish institutional priorities outside the academy. I'm referring to concerns endemic to our field. Specifically, it's presentism, the fetish with the contemporary or the immediate past. Basically, researchers studying themselves or sometimes their grandparents. As it happens, this work tends to coincide with Jewish communal concerns, but it has another effect, and that is that it marginalizes many subfields across the discipline of Jewish studies. What do I mean? The ideology of neoliberalism, pervasive across the university, measures value in terms of deliverables, rewarding scholarship that's deemed relevant and impactful, especially work that's data-driven, empirically oriented, and focused on outcomes. This tends to privilege work that's familiar, comfortable, and straightforward, and denigrates, or at least tends to sideline, research that is more complex, disruptive, and uncanny. It's not exactly shocking that this type of scholarly environment reproduces hegemonic prejudices and priorities of our contemporary moment. By contrast, I'd like to see subfields across Jewish studies embrace the disorientation of critical thinking and patient theorizing. Doing this entails overcoming disciplinary boundaries to engage, for example, critical theory, critical race theory, queer studies, trans studies, and disability studies. This type of work would position us specifically to rethink categories like community and continuity. To be clear, some of our colleagues in sociology, ethnography, and American Jewish studies are doing exactly this type of critical work, including people here associated with the Katz Center. This is the type of work that we need to do more of. Hopefully, it'll pressure us to reconsider the neoliberal ideologies and hierarchies of sex, gender, class, and race that continue to condition scholarship across our field. Admittedly, this kind of deep thinking, close reading, and complex theorizing is neither straightforward nor convenient, and it seldom aligns with institutional pressures within the university or beyond. But this type of work opens us up to seeing our world and our realities differently. And for what is scholarship, if not to push us to think differently?
Thank you so much, Gilah. We'll turn now to Shaul Magid.
Thank you. I hope the siren is not, should be over in a minute. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, the Katz Center, and thank you, Gilah, for those remarks. I'm going to try to kind of piggyback on them a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to raise is the fact that it seems that a lot of this anxiety about continuity and community, first of all, of course, the question of continuity is an interesting one because it's a fairly new term. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, the term survivalism was more commonly used than was continuity. And the question we can ask is continuity simply a more genteel, less dissonant substitute for the language of survivalism? And of course, survivalism is something that was made very, very popular by Mayor Kahana in the 1960s and early 1970s. And of course, when we talk about continuity and survivalism, the question then comes up, continuity of what and survival of what? And it's not really clear whether we're talking about Jews or whether we're talking about Judaism or whether we're talking about some kind of combination of the two, or whether Judaism is really just kind of a utility for the continuity of Jews. And this raises an issue that Gilah raised about the idea of cis heteronormativity and reproduction, and basically just like making more Jews is good and making fewer Jews is bad, as opposed to what is basically being made in the making of those Jews and what makes them Jews to begin with. And I think part of the inflection point is that it seems like there's a destabilization that's going on a number of levels in the American Jewish landscape as I see it. First of all, as Gilah noted, on the question of gender, not only about LGBTQ rights or issues, but really collapsing the binary categories of gender more systematically, what that actually means. Questions of fidelity to the Jewish people or Jewish peoplehood or Israel. One can point to Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky's essay in Tablet magazine, The Un-Jew. Somehow the Jew who doesn't profess a certain fidelity to Israel is un-Jewed in some way. Or issues that came out in today's Tablet essay by Eli Stern about how ex-Haredi Jews have been marginalized in American Jewry in regards to Jewish financial resources. Now, there's a number of different ways that this stabilization is taking place. And I guess one question that we can ask, certainly in the context of the Katz Center, what role should Jewish studies as a discipline, what role should Jewish scholars as academics, what role should they play in this new territory of destabilization? And I think that's part of what Gilah and Rafe tried to address in their essays. What interested me, I mean, Gilah and Rafe can certainly speak to the content of their essays, but what interested me in reading their essays was the reception that it received, not only among American Jews or the Jews in the pews, but actually American Jewish studies scholars who somehow were made very uncomfortable, which I assume was the purpose of the essays to begin with, were made very uncomfortable with that kind of intervention. And I think this has to do with the shift that's been taking place over the last half century on Jewish studies scholars that I just want to point to. And it really comes down to a certain kind of severing between the Jewish studies academic and the rabbi that were basically kind of fused at a certain point. Most Jewish studies scholars before the 1970s, or many of the prominent ones, and I think Harry Wolfson might be the exception, were either rabbis or had some kind of rabbinical training. In other words, that the idea of studying Judaism in an academic context was not severed from the vocation of the rabbi, and many of those people saw themselves in some way as both academics and rabbis, and that there was no real dissonance between those two things. That became part of the pushback against Jewish studies, the institutionalization of Jewish studies in 1969 with the founding of the AJS, made by Jacob Neusner, who basically said, we're not rabbis, even though Jacob Neusner was a rabbi, but as a scholar, we're scholars. And if we're doing scholarship as rabbis, then we're really not doing scholarship. And that debate took place for a couple of decades, but I think we're really on the other side of that, whereas most people who study Judaism in the academy are not, first of all, are not male and are not rabbis, and don't necessarily see themselves as somehow connected or attached or serving American Jewish establishment interests. But to say that the academic study of Judaism in America has nothing to do with Jews or the Jews, I think is a bit I don't know. I think it's a bit superfluous in a way, and maybe Ben can speak to this, and maybe Ben and I disagree with it. Because, of course, in a sense, it does. Not only are some of us are actually studying the Jews in America, but those people are basically part of the constituency of the readers of our work. And therefore, I think a question should be asked, like, what is the role that we play? We're not basically serving that community, but it doesn't mean that those people aren't part of our audience. So what I wanted to suggest, and I've done this elsewhere in greater detail, is that, and this is something again back to Gilah and Rafe's essays, that we function in some way as gadflies to the normative, pushing against kind of normative commitments. For example, on questions of methodology, critical race theory, gender theory, and so on. Things that the American Jewish community doesn't necessarily want to hear because it only perpetuates and intensifies a particular kind of destabilization that they already feel from other ways. So in a sense, I know maybe this word isn't the best word to use, but it seems to me that Jewish studies scholars in America today serve in a way as kind of the contemporary version of a Jewish heretic. In other words, if you look at how Jewish heretics functioned historically, they were precisely pushing back against conventions, pushing back against normative practices, pushing back against way in which Jews defined themselves and identified themselves, the way in which Judaism was understood and practiced. Now, of course, heresy doesn't really function as an operative category in a kind of heterodox community, which American Jewry is. And yet, I think the role that we play constructively, perhaps, is to function in that heretical paradigm. And I think that's kind of what Gilah and Rafe's essay was. It was an intervention of academic heresy into the normative Jewish way that things were functioning. And so it's not an accident, of course, that Gilah works on Spinoza. I don't know whether she saw it that way as an extension, but it was Spinozistic in a certain kind of way. So I want to just end by saying that while Jewish studies as a community doesn't have a responsibility for continuity and doesn't have fidelity to the Jews, it certainly has a relationship to them and with them. The question is, what is the nature of that relationship, and whether the American Jewish community wants that relationship, or would rather that we go off and just do our work and leave them alone and let other people kind of solve their problems. So I'll just end here. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. There is so much to follow up on here as we move forward. Next, we will turn to Samira Mehta.
So I want to, of course, start by thanking Anne and the Cat Center. It's really a pleasure to be here what is for me very much this morning, because I'm coming to you from Colorado, and also to thank my fellow panelists, because I've found being in conversation with you leading up to this, and then also some of what you've said this morning, to be really helpful and clarifying for some of my own thoughts. For instance, and I'll talk about this a little bit, I love the vision of Jewish studies scholarship that Shaul just advanced. I also think that perhaps he's more optimistic about the state of the field of Jewish studies than I personally am in and at this moment. I also really, I think there's something absolutely vital in the framing that Gilah provided for what is at stake in debates about both continuity and community, right? What are whose concerns are privileged in those topics, in those fields, and in those conversations? And it's that relationship. Whose concerns are privileged by those fields, and what is the relationship between Jewish studies and Jewish studies scholarship, or I'm sorry, Jewish studies scholarship and sort of Jewish communal life, contemporary Jewish communal life, that I want to think with you about a little bit this morning. I was thinking about this as I drank a glass, as I had breakfast this morning and drank my orange juice out of a glass that my mother gave me. Is it good for the juice? Themed glasses. And I think that there is this question, right, of Jewish studies scholarship. And I think this is part of how Jewish studies scholarship has operated and gets evaluated by the question of, is this scholarship fundamentally good for the Jews? And I think that we need to think about what we mean when we ask that question. I don't think that that's necessarily a good or healthy framework for evaluation and rubric for Jewish studies scholarship, particularly in a world in which the concepts of Jewish continuity and Jewish community have a less questioned than they should be or could be status as what defines what's good for the Jews. And so what I mean there is to say that it's lovely to think of Jewish studies scholarship as playing a role of heretic, and I really would like us to, in some ways, strive for that, not for the sake of heresy, but because of what I think it is that good scholarship does. But it's very real that there are a range of factors that shape Jewish studies scholarship that can, in ways that can be really dangerous, put that scholarship in, I don't quite want to say a supplicant relationship to Jewish community, but a risky relationship to Jewish community. Jewish studies is a very well-funded field by and large, and the money for that comes from donors in the Jewish community. Individual Jewish studies programs at universities around the country, ask things like the National Jewish Book Award, all of these things exist in complicated relationship between the academic field of Jewish studies and Jewish communities and donors in Jewish communities. And as in any case where donorship is a factor, the hopes and desires and concerns of those communities. So that's one piece. The other thing that I think is true is, it is no longer true that to be a Jewish studies scholar probably also means to be a rabbi or a rabbinical school dropout or a rabbinical school, I don't want to say tourist, that sounds demeaning in a way that I in no way, shape, or form mean. But somebody with some exposure to that world. It's still true that those people are part of the field, and sometimes some of the most interesting and innovative scholars, right? It's not a binary where if you have training and fidelity to the rabbinate or to Jewish communal life, your scholarship is somehow overly concerned with the needs of the community and not maybe the demographic reality of the community. But there is this sort of question of, how does this reflect? I'm thinking, for instance, of what happened when in sort of a variety of newspaper settings, right? We saw the controversy around Mark Dollinger's book a year ago right now, right? So Mark was trying to publish a new introduction and epilogue to his book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, that that called into question the relationship of the Jewish community or various Jewish communities activist commitments. He was saying, what does it mean to have commitments to the Black Lives Matter movement when in fact most Jewish communities functionally white flighted it into the suburbs and are living in relatively racially homogenous communities in which they do not have strong, meaningful long-term connections to people of color, in particular to Black people and Black communities. What does it mean when Jews of color experience quite a bit of racism and gatekeeping as they try to interact with mainstream Jewish community? How does this work? And then in his epilogue, to talk more about what it means when, for instance, and he does an amazing job of what I think scholars should really do. And he said, I wrote this book as if there were Jews and there were Black people and they were never the same people. And he talks about speaking with Black Jewish leaders who call that into question and who basically say, why have you put these in binary opposition? And it's an amazing piece of scholarly honesty. And basically in the press, he was accused by leading Jewish studies scholars of airing dirty laundry, of failing to, of holding Jews accountable for things that they shouldn't be held accountable, which is to say for internal Jewish racism, but basically calling into question some of the possibilities of what he had found, essentially because it was either publicly airing dirty laundry or taking shots at an also vulnerable community in a way that didn't think about the very complicated relationship that white Ashkenazi Jewish communities have to white supremacy, right? Where they're both deeply hurt and damaged by white supremacist culture and also recipients of it, right? Beneficiaries of structural racism in American society. And so when that scholarship becomes hard to advance because of the concern that to tell those truths is not good for the Jews in some ways, then scholarship is being really damaged by a set of Jewish communal concerns in which the concerns are being made to look good or being told things that feel good, rather than having to grapple with the realities of a historical set of truths. And I'm very aware that as I pull examples, I am pulling what Gilah referred to as presentist examples, and I beg her forgiveness. She is a Spinoza scholar, but I'm a post-World War II historian. And so I, by the very nature of what I do, I'm going to be pulling those examples. But I really want to say that part of what I think is so important there is something that we can get from my colleagues who do not work on the contemporary period, right? It's why it's so important that Gilah's voice is one of the voices on this panel. And it's because these are, as both she and Shaul have already pointed out, historically specific terms. Jewish continuity is a term that is about my age, right? And while I am no longer young, I am, also not my grandmother. I'm not that old. And so these are specific terms. They're not eternal terms. They're historically contextual terms. And so understanding how scholars in other corners of Jewish studies or in other historical intellectual fields that have a sort of are not looking just at the past 50 years, understand and see these terms can be really helpful to us in thinking about where we as a field are right now and where we might potentially be able to go. And so with that, I'm going to thank you again for indulging me and letting me speak.
Amazing. I especially thank all of you for already getting a little bit of a conversation going. So with that, we'll turn to Ben Schreier, and then we'll bring everybody onto the screen at the same time. Ben.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Anne and the Cat Center and my fellow panelists, whom I have the very ambivalent task of following. The invitation asking us to participate described the event as a panel conversation on the ways community continuity have been deployed to triangulate between Jews and Jewish studies. That's a quote that we all received. In one sense, one might wonder why I'm here, as I'm sure I know far less about Jews, Jewish practice, and Jewish communities than my esteemed fellow panelists. From another vantage point, however, our topic and the invitation's passive construction go to the core of my scholarship of the past decade or so, which, situated in the field of Jewish literature, has focused on how the interdisciplinary field of Jewish studies has failed to adequately criticize its relationship to Jewish identity, as some of my panelists my co-panelists have pointed out. What I mean is that as an intellectual project, Jewish studies has not worked hard enough to disambiguate its scholarly objects, right, the Jewish stuff that we study, from its scholarly subjects, the people overwhelmingly Jewish by currently accepted metrics who are doing the studying. Another way of saying this is that it's too easy to presume that Jewish studies, as it's currently instituted, operates not only of Jews, right, but also for Jews via an unspoken assumption that it operates by Jews. Yet another way would be to say that it's too easy to think that the AJS is a Jewish organization. The danger here, in this unwillingness to think too much about the differences between the fields of its for and its assumed by, is a reactionary belief that Jewish continuity and Jewish community, these concepts, authorize Jewish studies scholarship. Again, I don't think I'm saying anything that hasn't sort of already been said today. Obviously, concepts of Jewish continuity and community can be valid objects of Jewish studies scholarship insofar as they've played a fairly significant role in Jewish history, culture, and society. That's stuff towards an examination of which Jewish studies presumably directs itself. And just as obviously, Jewish studies scholars can be concerned with Jewish continuity in their various capacities as individuals. But it's when Jewish studies scholars express and or act on an anxiety about Jewish continuity, understood as an authorizing framework for Jewish studies knowledge production, that I fear for the future of critical intellectual discourse. So as Anne pointed out, and as has been discussed, the panel germinated earlier this spring in a series of events going back a few years involving the Association for Jewish Studies and the social scientist and admitted sexual assaulter, Stephen Cohen. I won't get into the weeds, but the affair demonstrated that many Jewish studies scholars, including some in past and current AJS leadership, took Jewish continuity anxiety for granted as part of the brief of Jewish studies, and or considered it an important enough element of the business of Jewish studies to ignore the crimes of, and in some cases, labor to rehabilitate a sexual predator. As Gilah mentioned, right, Lila Corwin-Berman, Kate Rosenblatt, and Ronit Stahl argued at the time that a line can be drawn between Cohen's continuity scholarship and his abusive behavior, grounded in the patriarchal privilege expressed in both. And I largely agree with that. And Gilah and Rafe helped us see this as well. So a couple of things are worth mentioning here. First, the behavior of many in leadership positions in Jewish studies and the AJS demonstrates cogently how Jewish continuity discourse exerts a gravitational pull on those who embrace, either explicitly or tacitly, its nationalist imperatives. And this force is pernicious to the extent that it deforms and degrades institutions and perverts scholarly inquiry. Second, the institutional implications of the presumption, often baked into Jewish studies intellectuality, that Jewish studies, including the AJS, is somehow Jewish, are profound. And the fact that so many scholars and intellectuals operating in the Jewish studies orbit take for granted an adjacency between Jewish community discourse and Jewish studies discourse beggars belief. As I said in the opening, it's one thing if, as a Jewish studies scholar, one is concerned with Jewish continuity as a scholarly object. But it's another thing entirely if, as a Jew worried about Jewish continuity, a Jewish studies scholar deputizes one's professional role to that anxiety. Assuming that Jewish continuity or community, that is, as an anxiety about population, right, which is what it is, should operate as a framework in which Jewish studies scholars pursue their work is perilous to the extent that it subordinates intellectual inquiry and the institutions that support it to nationalist imperatives. It may be easy to argue that a sexual predator's crimes are irrelevant to the value of their scholarship, but institutionalizing an identitarian or, more intensively, ethno-nationalist infrastructure for the legitimation of intellectual work is a terrifying prospect. I have nothing to say about Jewish continuity and community except that we owe it to what remains of the best of the Enlightenment project to make sure that we contest their operating as motivating factors for the pursuit and legitimation of Jewish studies scholarship. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I have some follow-up questions that I want to put to you all, but before I do, I just want to give any of the speakers an opportunity to follow up on something that they particularly wanted to respond to. If you want, just pipe up. So go ahead.
Very, very quickly, I think one of the things that needs to be talked about that hasn't been raised is the question of resources and philanthropy and money. In other words, where the money is coming from in order for Jewish studies as an academic discipline to continue to function. And that money has largely come from the community, right? And money isn't free. So in a certain sense, the community is basically making a certain kind of argument that the best bang for their buck is to give money to chairs in Jewish studies or programs in Jewish studies. Now, that's not to say that we necessarily have to be bound by that, but it's certainly going to produce a certain kind of tension when we don't actually produce that which they expect to be produced by the money that they're giving. Now, again, this is something that Aaron Hughes talked about in an entire book, and it's something that a lot of us who have taught in Jewish studies programs and held Jewish studies chairs are constantly, dealing with. But I just wanted to raise that we can't really forget the fact that the American Academy is not necessarily committed to the study of Judaism, and that it tolerates it or promotes it largely because there's external funding to make it happen. And that's a piece of the puzzle as well.
In fact, Anne, you began by thanking the Klatt and Stern families, and this is the Katz Center. So all of this is within that context of philanthropy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually connects to the next question that I was going to put out there, perhaps indirectly, which is we actually received a question about this in the Q&A, but it's also a question that I've heard from other people and in general I've just sort of heard wondering about is what makes the field of Jewish studies in its structures or in its practices, in its assumptions, different from other kinds of area studies or ethnic studies approaches or fields. So for example, if you think about Black studies or LGBTQ studies, many people would say that the scholars who contribute to those fields are also activists, leaders in their communities in a way that doesn't seem to appear to them as problematic as it has come to seem to most Jewish studies scholars. So how do we account for that difference? What's the reason why in Jewish studies, we don't want that to be the case? As Shaul pointed out, generally we think that, our scholars ought to be not rabbis, we ought to be not of the community, but somehow in a more distant relationship to the community. If you all agree that that's the case, what's the difference and why? And could those other approaches be a sort of model for how to navigate? Samira, you want to go ahead?
I would love to answer this in part because my position is a dual appointment between women and gender studies and Jewish studies. And I came to this position from a position in religious studies, which is where my training is. And I think that this question of, is Jewish studies more like religious studies or more like women and gender studies is something that I have been thinking about a lot. And I think that women and gender studies, ethnic studies, Black studies, there is this understanding of these departments as activist departments. And they're born at the same moment. Jewish studies is born out of the same kind of cultural moment that birthed women's studies, now women and gender studies, or women, gender and sexuality studies, Black studies, etc. But I think that there's a difference in who the constituency is, right? Who is the constituency of a women and gender studies department? And I think that in some ways, the concerns that we're raising around questions like funding, and I think Shaul is really right, like without funding from the community, there probably wouldn't be the kind of Jewish studies field that there is. There isn't that necessary, and I think that's kind of a numbers game. It's a question of how Jews are racialized in the contemporary United States in this moment, sort of how people are understanding and thinking about anti-Semitism, lots of questions. But in some ways, the constituency of a women and gender studies department is not the kind of white feminist, second wave feminist world that birthed it anymore, right? It is all people who have, all women and all people who have gender, right? So it's not cis women, it's women. It's also people with gender. And so it's non-binary people, it's men. It's thinking about the power relationships that are embedded into gender as a category, and then perhaps also doing some of the recovery work of still missing histories. Again, yeah, sure, of cisgendered white women, but of women of color, of non-binary people, of trans people. And Jewish studies hasn't done as good a job of making, and women in gender studies is maybe sometimes, it's not that there aren't donors, but they're not as prominent a piece of what's funding the engine, right? And at Jewish studies, in some ways, it's like that shift hasn't happened. The Jewish community is still very concerned with questions of continuity and sort of community boundary policing in ways that cause scholarship to be called into question. And so the example that I would give, I wrote a book called Beyond Chrismica that thinks about not what is the impact of interfaith families on Jewish communal life, not how do interfaith families shape Jewish institutions, not are they, again, bad for the Jews, but rather what motivates these families. I argued it isn't bad or harmful when they do both, or when they choose non-Jewish identities that work better for those families. I centered the needs and the worldviews of my informants, and I also problematized those and contextualized them. I talked to people who are doing both, who say they're not doing a third thing, they're doing both things. And I disagree. I think they are in that fusion doing a third thing. And I repeatedly, in Jewish studies settings at the AJS, but also in job interviews from like Christian theologians, was called to task for not adequately addressing the threat that these people pose to Jewish communal life. My own religious identity has been interrogated after every single paper on interfaith families I've ever given at the AJS. It has never been interrogated that way, at least not by non-Jews at the American Academy of Religion. There are people who are listening today who have made a point of standing next to me after panels so that they can help me defend myself from questions about my own religious identity or lack thereof. And that's a real thing that happens. And it happens because my work, which tries to give a very careful and detailed explanation of what motivates these folks, isn't perceived to serve, protect, or adequately be worried about the impact of those people on Jewish communal life, as if Jewish communal life shouldn't be called upon to change and evolve, or shouldn't just sort of organically. I don't even think it's my job as a scholar to issue that call. That's a different set of concerns than operate in women and gender studies, where actually the needs of the community to expand, to be more inclusive, have, yes, caused horrible fights in women and gender studies circles, but have resulted in a more intersectional form of women's studies. The policing operates in the opposite direction.
Thank you. I have a feeling some others might also want to speak to this topic. I see Ben. I wonder if Gilah also. Okay, so Ben, go ahead.
Just a couple of things to consider, and based on just in response to what has been said. So Chicano studies and African and Black studies started in the '60s as part of a larger effort to increase participation in the academy, right? I mean, it was part of an effort to get Blacks, Chicanos, right, into or to address this representational problem. At that time, yes, Jewish studies started at the same time, but Jews were already in the academy, right? So that's something to just consider. I'm not. It's not. It looks the same. Jewish studies kind of looks the same, but it has a different sort of origin story as a lot of the other studies fields. And second of all, the second thing I want to mention is Shaul's point about sort of without donors, there'd be no Jewish studies. That Jewish studies programs are dependent on donor money. The entire academy is dependent on donor money at this point, right? The urinals are named, right? I mean, everything is named. Everything is based on this model, right? So yes, Jewish studies is sort of academic Jewish studies is sort of dependent on. I have a name chair, we all have, we're all in some sense, our position here, our presence is somehow dependent on donors, but that shouldn't be considered part of an exceptionalist argument about Jewish studies. And that's where I guess I would push back against Shaul's point about Jewish studies scholars being kind of a new modality of Jewish heretic, right? That's a Jewish community term, right? I mean, I just because, yes, there's plenty in, what was the word you used? Sorry, I was taking, like Jews are part of our audience. Yes, but that's not a necessary fact, right? And that's not part of our identity as Jewish studies scholars, and it shouldn't be part of the identity of Jewish studies scholarship. So that's just a few things I would say.
Yeah, I would add, I think everyone's raising a lot of important points. I don't think it's helpful for us to think about the academy and what lies beyond it in some sort of strictly separated manner, which is to say what any scholar and whatever work they're doing can never be fully disaggregated from the cultural context in which they find themselves. The problem with Jewish studies is when particular values or agendas are then used to drive the scholarship, right? So which is why I'm urging for more critical thinking, right? Critical race theory and such, so that we're not just reproducing whatever values are outside the academy. As it comes to the issues of philanthropy, Ben's totally right. The entire university is really run by donors, and this speaks to decades of defunding of public education in this country and the neoliberalization of the academy itself. So we might need donors, as Shaul says, but the question is, how could those donors not be calling the shots and be responsible for the agendas of the work that we're doing?
Can I just jump in with a very quick, there's a great essay by Dorothy Kim, who's a professor of English at Brandeis, called The Historiographies of Pre-Modern Critical Race Theory and Jewish Studies, which just came out. It came out actually after Gilah and Rafe's essays came out. And it raises an interesting issue that's relevant to the question, which is whether Jewish studies sees itself as part of area studies or part of ethnic studies. And the difference, it really makes a difference where they see themselves in that way. And part of what Kim argues in the article is that that Jewish studies remain somehow tethered to the Jewish community because it can't really decide whether it wants to be an area studies subfield or whether it wants to be an ethnic studies subfield. Now, I can't do justice to Kim's argument here, but I just wanted to raise that. And the second point is that I know that those kinds of questions really come at us a lot. I will say from some of the critical race theorists in the African-American studies community that they do not see themselves that way. The Afro-pessimists do not see themselves as serving the Black community. A lot of the critical race theorists see themselves as undermining or subverting or challenging precisely the kinds of civil rights oriented cultural kind of mapping of the African-American experience. So I think that if you look at the Afro-pessimists and some of the other critical race theorists, you see that they're actually pushing back against the conventions about how race was constructed, not only from white America, but from within Black America also.
Okay, so just a really quick follow-up to that. I want to ask either Shaul or someone else, if you want to just articulate what the difference is between ethnic studies and area studies, because I'm sure that that's not obvious to everyone. Shaul, do you want to say?
Yeah, I wrote about it a little bit in the essay that I wrote, kind of responding to Gilah and Rafe, but which I actually have on my screen here, but I'm not gonna burden you with reading it. Um, I can't really do justice to that, but it's very interesting when you think about it, because it does actually address a series of questions about race, about ethnicity, about whiteness within among Jews, and the ways in which those questions of ethnicity and race and what the difference between those two things are, and questions of area, which then speaks to territory and geography and diaspora and homeland, and the way in which I think that Jewish studies never really had to kind of come down one way or the other on this question. So in a certain way, what she's saying is, yes, area studies subfields very often see themselves very tied and tethered to the communities that they're studying. Whereas ethnic studies is really more about the general notion of race, and therefore doesn't see itself necessarily connected to any particular race. So when people talk about critical race theory, it's not only about Black people, it's about people of color. So that's talking about a wide swath of the world that deals with Asian Americans, it deals with Native Americans, it deals with Black people, it deals with brown people, right? So when you're talking about ethnic studies, you're not talking about a specific people. You're talking about a phenomenon, the phenomenon of ethnicity and how it functions within a kind of intellectual context. So I think that's really the difference. In one way, I think Jewish studies kind of wanted to have it both ways, and the result of which they weren't able to haven't really been able to make the decision about their relationship to the community itself.
Gilah, did you want to?
I mean, I would just circle back to some of the comments that were made before, which is also, as Shaul was saying, lots of Jewish studies professors used to be rabbis, and now that's different. Or Samira spoke about how at AJS she's pressed, to speak to her identity, or pressed on that. I mean, I don't think it's helpful for us to essentialize identity either. I'll publicly confess that I'm actually also an ordained rabbi, as is Shaul, right? So 50% of our panel critiquing Jewish studies is actually made up of people who are also rabbis, and people who are very much also embedded in the Jewish community. So I don't think it's helpful to think in terms of, rabbis and super Jews will come in with certain types of agenda and others won't, right? So a lot of this just speaks to types of critical thinking and and what type of scholarship we want to be practicing, and not necessarily essentializing all of us to our identities, much as we would hate if somebody would say that somebody who they don't deem sufficiently Jewish or past Jewish enough, that they couldn't be a scholar of Jewish studies. That's ridiculous. And the same goes with racism. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to be clear, I think I explicitly said we don't want to put these things in a binary. And I spent breakfast yesterday sort of debating the merits of applying to rabbinical school with a friend who is a rabbi and who was kind of pressuring me to do so, right? But I think that the problem here is absolutely this question of what are the critical thinking bars of scholarship. There's no earthly reason that somebody can't have really strong commitment to a given movement in Judaism, to life as a rabbi, to the Jewish community, to the Catholic Church, and be an ordained priest, and not do exceptional and extraordinary critical scholarly work. And, I mean critical here in the scholarly sense, not in the tisk sense, work in Jewish studies. But the question is, where are your commitments? How are you thinking about them? Are you trying to gain purchase on sort of what your own bias or inclination is? Are you really asking what's at stake for the people that you're thinking about, rather than pathologizing them for not having the same thing be at stake that is for you? I say, as an ethnographer and a contemporary historian, I think there are other ways to frame that. And I don't think I think that Shaul is absolutely correct as well to say our work is in relationship to community. As we were preparing for this, Ben sort of said, but as a member of a, how did you put this, Ben, in a like liberal democracy or something like that, why would I be more concerned about racism in the Jewish community than in the world at large? And my response, and in this case, I did sort of go for identity, right? My response as a woman of color is, in general, I'm more concerned about racism in American policing than I am about racism in the Jewish community. I also, as a human being, engage with the Jewish community at a higher rate than I engage with police. And so it's personally more of a pain in my neck when I experience racism in Jewish community. I'm not intellectually more worried about it, but I'm not a scholar of the American legal system. I really appreciate the people who do that work. That's not where my work goes. So even if I, as a citizen, might be more concerned about racism in a different venue, this is the community, this is where I have an audience, and this is where I have expertise, right? And so I think that, and that expertise and that audience is partly based in what I study. It would be silly to pretend that it's not in part based in my identity, right? It would be really, really silly to suggest that I don't have more of a platform in Jewish communities than a colleague in Jewish studies who is maybe not a member of Jewish communities, right? I have personal connections that result in invitations to speak in ways that I also write about Catholicism, and I don't have those connections in that world. And I am sometimes invited to speak in that world, but at a much lower rate. Right. And so this is where, like, Gilah's right, you can't drop a wall between identities, but you do have to have standards for what it means to do scholarship despite or given identities.
Really helpful. So I just want to note that we've hit our hour, but I'm just going to take the prerogative to say we'll go a little over, and those of us who need to leave can catch up with the video on YouTube once it's posted. So Ben, I see that you want to respond, and then I have one follow-up question that I'll put to all of you to try to answer briefly. Ben, go ahead.
Great. So yeah, thanks. And so I want to respond a little bit to what Samira was saying, but also to a question that Lila mentioned in the Q&A. Responding to my point that scholars shouldn't deputize their professional role to anxiety about Jewish continuity. And her question, a great question, is like, does that mean we have to excise politics from our scholarship? Absolutely not. What I'm talking about is I'm worried about deputizing our scholarship to identitarian anxiety about population, not about politics. I mean, politics belongs in the academy. What I would argue against is understanding politics as somehow a function of population and identity, one's like membership in a community. That's their politics is much broader than that. And this goes to Samira's point, like, yeah, I mean, you know, we need to work against racism, and I'm not gonna, like, because I'm a Jewish studies scholar doesn't mean that like somehow I'm more sensitive to racism in Jewish populations. Frankly, maybe I am, but I'm more sensitive to Jewish racists and to racism directed at Jews. That's all. I just think that, like, we can't understand politics as somehow a subset of heritable identity. That's what I would argue against.
Okay, so with a few minutes left, I want to bring together a couple of strands that I heard you guys picking up. So for one thing, I was struck by Ben's pointing out that, of course, the story of the field of Jewish studies is a different one, has a different origin story than other ethnic or area studies fields. Not only in that Jews were already in the academy, but also, of course, that there was academic Jewish scholarship before that, going back to Wissenschaft to Studentums and even beyond, right? And some of the questions that are being hashed out here in this conversation, did I just freeze?
No, you're good.
Okay. Some of the questions that you guys are hashing out are familiar from early conversations among those 19th century Jewish scholars, right? And among them, is the question of whether such scholarship speaks to Jews and for the Jewish community, or speaks in general to some kind of collective humanistic scholarly world, right? And there I pick up on something that Samira said, that in other such programs, the way that they've come to be framed is not, for example, in women's studies or LGBTQ studies, to be speaking only to cis women, but speaking to anybody who has gender or thinks about gender, right? So if we think,
uh-oh, now you freezed. You're frozen.
Yeah, I lost her too.
And you're back, but I think you've said enough. We could answer the question. Oh, are you here now?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, Zoom just totally shut down on me. I'm not sure where I ended, but where I was getting to was the question of, if you can think for a moment about the future of the field and where we can go from here, if there are aspects of the Jewish Studies project that can speak to communities beyond a Jewish community narrowly understood, right? Is there a way of conceiving of your own work in your fairly disparate fields that you four work within, that you think is a contribution to some wider enterprise, and that could be recognized and even, you know, funded by something beyond the Jewish community? And I'll just let you guys decide who wants to start, if anyone wants to pick that up.
I would just say briefly that it's a very good question, a very complicated question, and I think that it suggests that perhaps there's a kind of cloistered quality to Jewish studies, certainly in the various Jewish studies departments that remain. I mean, there are very few of them now, and I think they're not part of the future. One of the things that would help was the way in which Jewish studies as programmatically can begin to partner itself with other programs and other departments and become more integrated into the academy. Now, on a basic level, it means getting our courses cross-listed with other departments, but it's more than that. It's really about, in some sense, maybe joining the other departments and other programs, so that we're getting other students outside of those who are either heritage students or students who happen to have a Jewish boyfriend or girlfriend. I mean, you know, just as an example, I mean, I teach a course, Jews and Race, at Dartmouth, that is cross-listed with AAAS, which is African American Studies, and this is a class that only had one Jew in it. And most of this, I had African American students, I had African students, I had Native American students, because it was cross-listed in AAAS. It would have never attracted those students if it was just a Jewish Studies course. So that's one easy programmatic way to do it. But then once you do it, once you're no longer talking to Jews, then you have a whole different, set of concerns and challenges in trying to make the subject that you're dealing with both relevant and interesting to people outside of that community. So
I don't.
Go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead.
No, go, Samira. Sorry, you're going to say this better
all
than I
of
can.
my classes. So the way that my contract is written, one class is the purview of Jewish studies, one of women and gender studies. The rest are cross-listed, but effectively, unless I'm teaching somebody a survey course requirement, everything is cross-listed. So I routinely have about 40 students, around 10 of whom are Jewish. I find that you have to make sure that you're clarifying things that for the non-Jewish students, but you really should be for the Jewish students as well. A fundamental piece of what it is to teach Jewish studies is to make sure, A, you can't assume that everyone is coming with the same bench of information, but B, Jewish studies isn't Hebrew school. And so you need to be clarifying and saying, like, we're thinking about these things in social relation. But that said, like, the piece where I think that inherently, I don't know that having non-Jewish students in the room makes that more challenging. I think it makes it more interesting, and I think it makes it more dynamic. But barring that, I think Shaul is absolutely correct. I have, again, my classes are usually, my smallest classes are capped at 40. They're usually within 5 students of full. They're usually full at the start, but I'm mean and scary. And so I lose about 5 people. And they cross-pollinate. Women and gender studies students take my classes, learn about Judaism, end up in my colleague Hillary Kellisman's classes on Israel-Palestine, because they're interested in the intersection of gender and post or decolonial thought, right? And they like me, and they discover that the Jewish Studies program is working hard to build community, and so they go and explore those ideas in her classes. Or, you know, they get interested in a question that I reveal that there's some sort of biblical basis, and they end up in a religious studies, Jewish studies cross-listed class with my colleague Sam Boyd, who is our Hebrew Bible. I think he's our Bible guy, but he's our Hebrew Bible specialist. And so you can see people move around, and it's precisely because we're a program in which every tenure stream faculty member has a primary tenure home. And so my students end up in the history department through Jewish studies, end up in the religious studies department, and it works well.
Ben, go ahead.
Well, I just think that I was going to see if I was muted, which maybe I should be. I would just push back against Shaul's point, like that somehow we have to, you know, if there aren't Jews in Jewish studies classes, you have to work harder at relevance. I mean, Gilah's point about critical thinking, like our primary role has to be like not assuming that someone's personal experience counts as scholarly relevance. I just, or at least to contest the easy identification of the two. I mean, maybe I'm just lucky that I rarely get any Jews in my classes, but I really push back against that model of Jewish studies scholarship.
Yeah,
I think it's dangerous.
It's even the question that makes me uncomfortable. And I think this pretense or this notion that it needs to have impact or be relevant or speak to X audience, I think is extremely dangerous, right? And that's what I mean in terms of critiquing a certain neoliberal ideology whereby scholars need to justify the import or the worth
Completely.
of the work that they're doing, right? Any type of scholarship is simply an attempt to understand our shared worlds. That's it. And that, for me, and I may be old school, is a reason unto itself. And you asked us to speak specifically to our own experience. I am routinely asked to justify what is Jewish about Spinoza. So I'm constantly asked, like, what is Jewish about the work you do? So, and I resent the question, and I resent the question to call for its relevance, but I think these things are not as simple as they seem. And the field of Jewish studies is just so vast, just in terms of geography and time, place, language, the nature of our texts, our material, like the materials, it's so vast and so capacious, right? So I think we get lost when we focus on a very narrow segment of audience, if it's, you know, a certain number of students or people who might read our books or to people we're whom speaking. And I wonder if scholars in other fields ask themselves these type of questions with the same type of zealousness, right? Or expectation that they answer. And I'm not so sure.
I mean, I will say, I think my women and gender studies department certainly asks about relevance. And I mean, I think that I really want to agree with you, right? Like in theory, I absolutely agree with you. I'm at a public university who has as part of its mandate serving the public in an increasingly shrinking pool of resources. And yeah, I don't like the neoliberal university either, but I think that the relevance conversation is part of the game of survival, right? If you want to survive, to teach the way and the content that you need to teach, you need to hit a certain enrollment number. And that you need to hit whatever it is to keep from getting canceled. But if you want to run the class again, you need to hit well. And that means that at the same time that you're trying to convince students that what is relevant is the joy of intellectual inquiry, you're having, before you get them in your room to try to set them on fire with the joy of intellectual inquiry, you have to get them to sign up for the class. And that means that you need to, and I feel ill as I say this, but you need to market it. And you need to market it because that's the Like that's the economic system in which we're working. And I worry that if we don't acknowledge it, then we can fight it, but I think we have to fight it from working within the system at this point. And I don't like that. I mean, I really, really, really don't like that. But I think that, you know, if I can come up with a cute, sexy, gimmicky title that gets my students in the room, that causes them to think that in some way this will be about them. And I'm lucky I teach about reproduction, and we're in a moment in which all they need to do is turn on the news. So I actually don't have to work very hard at this. But you know, that's how you get them there, to try to get them to have those passions.
Right. But I want to be sensitive to the time, but I think we need to distinguish between relevance and meaning. And I think too often relevance is reduced to the familiar, that which speaks to my literal experience, that which speaks to what's in the news, and pushes us to prioritize contemporary forms of study. And meaning is not exclusive, right, to contemporary affairs or American Jewish studies, which are important subfields in and of themselves, right? The question is, how can students, audience, or people appreciate the relevance or meaningfulness of studying texts across, right, the diverse history, geography, and texts of Jewish studies, right? And that, to me, is what it means to overcome a certain market economy or expectation of the neoliberal academy.
Sure, but the colleague who teaches, my colleague Eli Sachs teaches a class called Is God Dead? That, you know, is absolutely based in non-contemporary readings, but it's in asking these sort of bigger, broader questions that are very appealing. This class always got a wait list. Like, students are always complaining that they can't get into it, and it's great. And of course, what's going on there is that it's being taught by somebody who is structuring this curiosity around a particular set of engagement and moment in life, right? Like a sort of young college student age set of inquiries, as well as being like deeply dynamic and excited about the material and infectious in the excitement about the material. I guess we're in a moment in which the word infectious isn't a compliment, but take it as one, right? And that's, and so like, yeah, there's meaning there, but I think that part of the pedagogical job is to show people how a text rooted in the 18th century should and could matter to them. I like to say that the most meaningful thing I did in my college career was take a seminar that trotted me through every single play Shakespeare wrote, which has done nothing for my academic life, but has enriched my life hugely at every moment. That is relevance.
I want to hear so much more from all of you. I think we could absolutely go for another hour, but we shan't. Ben, did you want to say one last thing? I saw you trying to get a word.
Oh, I just that, like, relevance. Yes, what Samira was saying. Obviously, we have to sell ourselves. I just was pushing against the implication that there's some like identity bound self-evidence that somehow in Jewish studies, speaking to Jews, we don't have to work that hard. That's all.
Right, yeah. And I don't disagree with good pedagogy being that which speaks to students, right? It's just a certain expectation or a certain market economy that I find troublesome.
Yeah.
I think if I could just, I know we're out of time. I think I'm the only one of the four of us that actually has taught in a rabbinical seminary, and it's a very, very different experience than teaching in a university, and teaching the different experience of teaching in a public university versus teaching in a private university. And one of the big things that one has to be aware of is that when you're teaching in a rabbinical seminary, there's an unreflexive we that always seems to penetrate the entire experience, which is true, by the way, in Israel. You go to Israel to an international conference and everybody's talking about we, and what they mean by we is Jews, but there's not everybody is Jewish that's sitting there, but it doesn't seem to matter. It's an unreflexive way. You know, I know in my classes, and I'm sure this is true with many of you, right? Whenever a Jewish student uses the word we, I always correct them. There is no we here, right? You happen to be a Jew, but the person sitting next to you isn't. So just because you happen to be a Jew and I happen to be a Jew, that's not a we in the context of the project of what we're doing. But it is true just on the pragmatics that, we're dealing with 18, 19-year-old kids, and they're, they want meaning, but they also really want relevance. That's what's going to bring them into the room. So we're challenged to be able to kind of make that happen. I don't think that I don't mean to say that it's more challenging to make a course relevant when you're teaching kids from Angola and from a tribal community in Oklahoma. They're coming to the course. But it's a different kind of teaching experience because you're not being forced to press the students against the identity politics that brings them into the room, right? That's all I was saying on that point.
All right. Once again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of these comments. I absolutely mean it that I would love to continue the conversation with you if we had time. Samira, Mehta, Shaul, Magid, Gilah, Kletenik, Ben, Schreier, thank you for being here. And thanks to everyone in the audience who stuck around.